In the previous video, we looked at arrays and how they're built, how they're constructed, how they're referenced. In this video, we're going to look at how to use loops to process the elements in an array. By default, the elements in an array are numbered 0 through some number, which makes them really nice to process with a loop that is designed to count from 0 to some number. So we often use for loops to process arrays. So let's take a look at one here. As an example, here's some code that puts the numbers 1 through 10 into an array. So we declare an array right here called numbers, and we declare it as an empty array. That's what the square braces mean. This is going to be an array, empty array called numbers. And we have a small for loop with a counter variable that's going to count from 0 until that number is less than, as long as that number is less than 10. So it's going to count from 0 to 9. And the reason we're doing 0 to 9 instead of 1 through 10 is because the indexes for an array start at 0. So we have 0 through 9 for our indexes. Into those elements, we're going to put 1 through 10. So in this example, we're taking whatever the counter variable is, and we're adding 1 to it. So the first time through, the I will be equal to 0. So I plus 1 is 1, and we're assigning it to number sub 0. Second time through, I will be 1. So number sub 1 is going to be equal to 1 plus 1, which is 2. The next time through, I will be equal to 2. The number sub 2 will be equal to 2 plus 1, which is 3. And when we're all done, we'll have an array that has the numbers 1 through 10 in it. Now, let's write some code, look at some code that will display the numbers in that array. So we have a display string that we're using here that's starting out as an empty string, and we're going to add things to it to build it up. So we have a for loop, again counting from 0, as long as that counter variable stays less than the length of the array. This is very handy to process all the items in an array with a for loop. We have the loop start at 0, and we count using the counter variable as long as it's less than the length of the array, and which will make it count up to the number that is 1 less than the length, which should be the last index of the array. It's going to count by ones. And in this case, we're taking number sub I, so we'll take number sub 0 and add a space. We'll take that string, we'll add on number sub 0 and a space, the next time through number sub 1 and a space, next time through number sub 2 and a space, and it will just keep concatenating onto this display string. And then at the very end, we'll print it out, and we should see 1 space 2 space 3 space 4, etc. Here's some code to put 4 totals into an array. So we're doing this manually. We start out with an empty array. Total sub 0 equals this. Total sub 1 equals this. Total sub 2 equals 411. Total sub 3 equals 135.75. Now let's add up those numbers to get a grand total. So we declare an accumulator variable called sum, set it equal to 0. Each time we go through this loop, our index number will go up 0 all the way up to 1 less than the length of totals. So the length of totals is 4 here, so it's going to count 0 through 3. And each time it's going to take the value of that element and add it to the current sum. So we'll start out with the sum equals 0. First time through, total sub 0 is going to add in 141.95. Then the loop will repeat. I will be 1, so it will add in the value of total sub 1, which is 212.25. It'll add that to the sum, and it'll continue on adding each of these values to that accumulator variable. At the end of the loop, the sum will have the total of all the numbers in the array. So here's a piece of code that takes what we did here, and it's going to display the totals, and it's also going to display the sum. So we're using another for loop to display the totals with inside a string. So it's counting from 0 to 1 to while it's less than the length. And we're concatenating on total sub I plus a new line character. I think in the previous example we did something with a space. With the numbers 1 through 10 we did that. In this example we're going to add the number plus a new line character. And all through this we're building up this string with total sub 0 and total sub 1, total sub 2. Once the loop is done processing, it's going to print out the totals are, it's going to go to a new line, it's going to print out that total string, which has each of these numbers, 141, 212, 411, and then another new line to display that sum that we calculated earlier. Sum is 900.95. So using an accumulator string, we're concatenating onto it, finally printing out the summary at the end. All right, so that's a normal for loop using index numbers. And the next thing we're going to talk about is a for in loop, which doesn't use index numbers, but it also gets each element out of the array one at a time. I take that back. Before we do, I was thinking a for of loop. We're going to do a for in loop, which does use index numbers. I apologize for that. So the way this for in loops work is it uses for. We initialize an index number in the array. So here's an example. Let I in totals. So it takes the number of elements in totals and says we're going to count through each number or each item in that array until we get all the way done. So we don't have to actually use the length. It automatically knows the length. We don't have to initialize I at 0. It's automatically going to do that for us. So it's just a shorter way of using a for loop in this case. And each time we're going to get total sub I and add it to the sum. So we're doing the exact same thing we were doing back here, but writing it is much shorter. We're still using I for the variable. We're still doing this, but we're not doing the initialization explicitly. We're not doing the test for the index number being less than the length explicitly, and we're not doing the I++ explicitly. Instead, we just say let I in totals, and it automatically does all those things for us. It creates much shorter, easier to read code, still using an index number. Still works the same way. It goes up by 1 each time. I starts at 0. It counts as long as I is less than the length. It's a shorter way to write it, much more concise, much easier to read. And the last for loop we're going to talk about is the for of loop. This one is different. It does not use index numbers. So in this one, we are going to set a temporary variable. So the syntax is for and then value initialization. We have to give it a variable to use to temporarily hold the value of the item in the array. Okay, it's not going to use index numbers anymore. Let's take a look down here. Let value of totals. So it's going to take each item in the array called totals, and it's going to get the value out. It's not going to get it out by index number. It's just going to pull the value directly out. And in this case, we're just going to add it onto the sum. And we get the exact same result. So this is a temporary variable that holds each value rather than using an index number. Okay. You have to be careful when you use this one. It's great for accessing each item in an array. However, because you don't have an index number, you cannot use a for of loop to actually set a value in an array. You can only use it to read each value in an array. You can't modify them. All right, in the next videos, we're going to look at some examples. I think I have one more example. It's a familiar example that we've already seen, but now we're going to do it with arrays and loops instead of the way we had done it earlier. We talked about arrays so far. We talked about elements being an item in an array. We talked about how to find the length of an array. We talked about an array literal, although I may not have used it, but when we initialize array and just put explicit values separated by commas, that's an array literal. We talked about indexes. We talked about for in statements and for in loops and for of loops. So I think we're good to go, other than looking at an example using some of these last methods.